I want you to think back to your kids and the gifts they've gotten over the years. Which ones did they enjoy the most? Now, I realize some of you have to think way back. It may be troublesome, but think back. Which ones did they enjoy the most? I think for our kids, without a doubt, this is what they enjoyed the most: a flashlight. I hate to think about how many I've given to them over the years, how many I've bought. There's the pen light, there's the countless lightsabers, there's the common flashlight, there's the battery-powered lantern, there's the incandescent fluorescent combination light, and then there was that 10-battery 500 lumen mag light. Every time the power would go out at night in our house, our kids would leap with joy, run up to their rooms and grab their flashlights. They just had fun when the power would go out with their flashlights. I've learned a few things. One of the things I've learned is you can't carry on a conversation in a room full of kids with flashlights. The second you open your mouth, they turn it on, they shine it right in your face. You can't see. It blinds you. It's frustrating. It's as if they can't hear your words unless they see your lips moving or something. It's weird. I don't know how many times I've been blinded by that 5-pound mag light by one of our boys. No one likes being blinded by light. It's annoying, it's frustrating, you can't see, you want to shield yourself from its glare, but can you imagine being blinded and not know it? In other words, you think you can see, but you can't. Now, that's exactly what Jesus is facing in Mark chapter 8. Now, Mark is going to introduce us to three groups of people, each of whom thinks they can see clearly, but they can't. They're blinded. In fact, turn with me to Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, and let's shed some fresh light on a story that you might be well familiar with. Notice verse 1 begins this way. In those days, the multitudes being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitudes because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. The first thing I see in this text is that Jesus must have been some kind of communicator. He kept them engaged for 3 days. But it's more than that. He kept them so enthralled that they were ignoring their hunger. Pastors can't keep a congregation together very much after 12 noon, or there's a riot on his hands. Jesus has kept these hungry people engaged for 3 days. And at the end of the 3 days, he says, we need to get them something to eat. They've got nothing to eat. Now, this is the story of the feeding of the 4,000. And it's very similar to the feeding of the 5,000. In fact, critics have complained that it's too similar, that it's the same story. And it's true that in both stories you have similarities. In both stories you have a little bit of food. And in both stories, Jesus takes that little bit of food and he multiplies it. And in both stories, everyone is satisfied, and in both, they collect the leftovers and they fill numerous baskets. Could the critics be accurate? Could Mark have accidentally included the same story twice? Well, even though there are similarities between the stories, there are some profound differences between the two. In this story, you got Jesus initiating the feeding of the 4,000. In the previous story, the feeding of the 5,000, you have the disciples initiating their feeding. So you have Jesus initiating and the disciples initiating the others. Why aren't the disciples initiating in this story? Well, I think in the previous story, it's the disciples who got hungry. And instead of going to Jesus and looking him in the eye and saying, hey, we're hungry, we got to make it to McDonald's before it closes, they say, you know, this crowd, we need to release them so they can go get something to eat. And that's what they do in Mark chapter 6. The disciples are the ones that I think are hungry. But in this story, Jesus initiates it and not the disciples. Now, why? Well, I think the answer is found in who's got the food. In fact, look at verse 4. He says, the disciples answered him, meaning Jesus, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? And he, that is Jesus, says, how many loaves do you have? And they said, well, we got 7. Now, can you see what's going on in the text? The disciples have a full stash of food. Everyone else is out of food. They're hungry, but the disciples have plenty. They're satisfied. They didn't see the need of the crowd because they were focused on themselves. On themselves. Now, you can't really be too hard on the disciples. I mean, it's natural. It's human nature to focus on ourselves first. I mean, how many husbands have bought a fishing pole for their wife's birthday? Or maybe a shop vac for Christmas. And how many wives have bought tickets to Les Miserables for anniversary? We just naturally think of ourselves first. And we do come by it naturally. If you've ever taken care of toddlers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We come across our selfishness at an early age. In fact, several years ago, I ran across this. It's called the Toddler's Creed. I want you to see if you can recognize any selfishness. Every toddler holds to these 10 tenets. Number 1, if I like it, it's mine. Number 2, if it's in my hand, it's mine. Number 3, if I can take it from you, well, it's mine. 4, if I had it a little while ago, it's still mine. Number 5, if it's mine, it must never appear to be yours in any way. 6, if I'm building something, all the pieces are mine. 7, if it looks like mine, well, it is mine. 8, if I saw it first, it's mine. 9, if you're playing with something, you put it down, it automatically becomes mine. And 10, if it's broken, well, it's yours. So, see how unnatural it is to be unselfish? Well, that's exactly where the disciples are right now. They're blinded by their self-interest. I mean, you could say while the people were hungry for lunch, the disciples were literally out to lunch. They were eating what they had. But notice, as the disciples are focused on themselves, well, Jesus has a little different focus. Jesus is focused on others. Look back at verse 2. It says, Jesus says this, I have compassion on the multitudes because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. Jesus says, I have compassion. Now, the word compassion is an interesting word. It's the Greek word splagizomai. Doesn't that just sound interesting? Splagizomai. In the New Testament, it's used primarily in reference to God, referring to His bowels, His guts, His intestines. In other words, when Mark says that Jesus felt compassion, it meant that His bowels were wrenched. His heart was split open and the most vulnerable parts of Him were laid bare. And in fact, this word is used also in the New Testament in reference to the womb. And in fact, this word compassion is such a deep, central, powerful emotion that it can only be explained in light of a woman giving birth to a baby. It's a powerful word. So when it says that Jesus has compassion for us, what he's saying is that his innermost being, everything within him is being moved toward us. That's his affection toward you. In fact, Jesus is so compassionate toward you that he accepts you where you are. I mean, no matter what you've promised, you don't have to clean yourself up. No matter what you've done, he comes to you and accepts you exactly where you are. And that's exactly what Jesus does with the disciples. In fact, I find it fascinating that he doesn't confront the disciples on their selfishness. He doesn't rebuke them about forgetting what he had done a couple of weeks earlier in the feeding of the 5,000. Do you know what Jesus does? He includes them in a process. A process that will help them get their eyes off themselves. Look at verse 6. And so he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took 7 loaves, the disciples' 7 loaves, and gave thanks. Broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And they set them before the multitude. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now, those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. Now, notice Jesus takes what the disciples have and uses their meager contribution to feed over 4,000 people. Now, it's obvious the disciples didn't have much. They had 7 loaves and a few fish. But what's amazing is God begins where you are with what you have. In other words, you want God to work in your life, then begin where you are with what you have. Take that and give it to Him and tell Him He can do with it what He wants. Now, you see, when Jesus said, I want to feed the crowd, the disciples are wondering how. First words out of Jesus' mouth are what? What do you have? It really didn't matter how much they had. The issue was, would they be willing to give it to Jesus? And then secondly, notice what God supplies, it's always enough to meet the need. I mean, right here, it's more than enough to meet the need. They end up collecting 7 baskets full of leftovers. Now, the word here used for basket is different than the word used in the 6th chapter of Mark when he fed the 5,000. This word means tall woven baskets. Commentators say that these baskets stood about 4 feet tall. They were big enough for a man to hide inside of it. And they ended up collecting leftovers, filling 7 of these tall baskets. But what I think is most encouraging here is that God seems less interested in our ability than our availability. I mean, so being available for God to use as He sees fit means there's no assignment that's going to be too small or no assignment that's going to be too big. I mean, between the great things we think we can't do and the little things we won't do, the great danger is we won't do anything. And yet, Jesus is most interested in our availability rather than evaluating our abilities. Did you know the most worthless item can become quite valuable depending upon whose hand it's in? I mean, take a used toothbrush. Would you buy a used toothbrush on Craigslist? No. But did you know one sold for $21,000 because it was once used by Napoleon? How about fake jewelry? Did you know a set of fake jewelry sold for over $211,000 because it was once owned by Jackie Onassis? You see, your value comes from your availability more than just your ability. So, after feeding the 4,000, well, Jesus and the disciples get in the boat and decide to head across the Sea of Galilee. Look at verse 10. And immediately got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha. Then the disciples came out and began to, and the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." So Jesus and the disciples hop in the boat. They set sail for a port on the western shore. You can see it on the map there. And when they get out of the boat, they're immediately confronted by the religious leaders, the Pharisees. These guys have been like bloodhounds, tracking Jesus wherever he goes, hounding him, looking for evidence that would prove that he wasn't who he is claiming to be, Messiah, and therefore God. Now, listen to this. When it comes to evidence, God does not want us to exercise blind faith. Now, He's given us the ability to reason, to think for ourselves, to research. When it comes to evidence that Jesus is who He claims to be, God doesn't want us to exercise blind faith. He wants us to exercise reasonable faith. And in this passage, Jesus is willing to give sufficient proof that He's God, but not exhaustive proof. In fact, that's exactly what He has been doing throughout His entire ministry when He began. He's been giving sufficient proof. He gave sufficient proof when He healed the sick, when He cleansed the leper, when He restored the sight to the blind, when He calmed the storm, when He fed the 4,000, when He fed the 5,000. Each one of those is sufficient proof that He is who He claimed to be, but none of them were exhaustive proof. Several years ago, I was invited by a friend. He called me on the phone. His company was thinking about buying a new helicopter and wanted to know if I wanted to join him in a test flight. Absolutely, I said. Now, I'd never been in a helicopter, so I was just a little nervous. And we got to the test flight site. I found out who was the pilot, and I kind of sauntered up next to him, and I said, "Yeah, so you've done a lot of these test flights, huh?" And he kind of smiled at me, and he said, "Are you nervous?" I said, "Well, this is my first time in a helicopter." He assured me he'd done plenty. And he said, "Tell you what, I want you to sit here." And he put me in the front seat, where there was glass above me stretching all the way around under my feet. It'd be like I'm hanging out in space. So I was just a little nervous, to say the least. Now, there's no way I could have guaranteed with 100% certainty that test flight would not crash. That would require exhaustive proof. What I was looking for is reasonable proof. So I found out about the company. It was a reliable company. Was the company reliable? Do they do maintenance on their helicopters? Yeah. Did the pilot seem to know what he was talking about? Yeah. Did the pilot look sober? Yeah. So that was sufficient proof. And as a result, I got on in the helicopter and buckled myself in. Now, here is the rub. I could only determine with probably about 80% certainty that helicopter wouldn't crash, and I'd be at home that night with Patty having dinner. But I had to take 100% of myself in the helicopter. I couldn't just take 80% of myself in. I had to take 100% of myself in the helicopter. You see, your commitment will always go beyond the evidence. Always. You can't prove anything with 100% certainty. You can't prove that Jesus rose from the dead with 100% certainty. It won't happen. The evidence is reasonable, but it's not exhaustive. In fact, French physicist and philosopher Blaise Pascal said this: "There's enough evidence to convince any man who is not dead set against it, but there's not enough evidence to force a man into the kingdom who will not go." Now that's where the Pharisees are. They're dead set against Jesus in spite of the proof. They are blinded, but they don't know it. That's the Pharisees. So what does Jesus do? He says, "No sign shall be given this generation," which means no further sign shall be given to this generation. He's saying, I have already given sufficient enough evidence for the Pharisees to believe, but they're ignoring it for them to see clearly. So the disciples and Jesus, they get back in the boat and they head back to Bethsaida. Look at verse 13. "And he left them, and getting in the boat again, departed for the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf with them in the boat. Then he," meaning Jesus, "charged them, saying, Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they," the disciples, "reasoned among themselves, Is it because we don't have any bread?" So the disciples and Jesus, they get back in the boat. And Jesus uses the boat ride as an opportunity to warn them about what they just encountered with the Pharisees. Notice, he says, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees, beware the leaven of Herod." Now leaven was something that could be added to a lump of dough that would cause it to rise. And it takes just a little bit of leaven, like you see on the screen, to have a pervasive effect over the entire lump of dough. So to call something having leaven was a common expression in Jesus' day. It was a way of saying leaven was something small but pervasive. So when Jesus says the leaven of the Pharisees, he's talking about something small, but over time can be pervasive and impact your entire life. And so the question is, what is the leaven of the Pharisees? Well, the Pharisees, they were pretty proud of their laws and their traditions. And they followed them and adhered to them with legalistic fervor. In fact, in the Old Testament, there are just over 600 laws that God had given Israel. But that wasn't enough for these guys. They added addendums to each law, and then addendums to the addendums, creating thousands upon thousands of rules and regulations they needed to obey. You see, they thought doing all the right things made you right with God. So they prayed 3 times a day. They went to synagogue on Saturday. They kept the sacrificial code. They wore the right clothes. They ate the right foods. They avoided the wrong foods. I mean, thousands of rules upon thousands of rules and regulations. They were so focused on legalistically obeying their rules and regulations, they missed the whole point. You see, Jesus is not as interested in rules as he is relationship. The Pharisees were blinded by their legalism. But he warns them that avoid the leaven of Herod. So what does that refer to? Well, Herod was a tetrarch of Galilee, appointed by Rome. He was their puppet. And he was enamored with everything the world had to offer. The Herodians, they compromised their Jewish heritage finding their significance in amassing more and more wealth. But it was more than that. They not only wanted to be rich and look rich, but they wanted to control their riches in order to stay in power. So, where the disciples are blinded by selfishness and the Pharisees are blinded by legalism, Herod is blinded by fame, fortune, and power. And Jesus, in the boat, is warning the disciples they can be blinded by the same things. But the problem is the disciples aren't paying attention. I mean, when Jesus mentions leaven, they immediately get on the subject of bread. Anybody have any bread? Oh, golly, we only have one loaf. And then someone probably says out loud, hey, didn't we collect a bunch of baskets full of bread back there a couple hours ago? I mean, who was in charge of the leftovers? Do you see what the disciples are doing? They're whining. They're focused on themselves again. So in order to combat the legalism of the Pharisees, the secularism of Herod, and the selfishness of the disciples, Jesus ends up asking 8 penetrating questions to help the disciples and us get our vision back. Look at verse 17. But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of fragments did you take up? And they said 12. Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said 7. So he said to them, how is it that you do not understand? So what is Jesus getting at, asking one question after another after another? Well, I think Jesus' point is you've got to guard your life because an unguarded life can spell disaster. So, how do we guard our life? Well, I think the answer is found in the questions. Look at verse 17. Why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? That Jesus is encouraging us and the disciples that we need to engage our minds. In other words, we need to stop. We need to think. We need to reflect on what's going on around us. Engaging our minds means analyzing why I'm so drawn to that new kind of car, or why I'm so enamored with a bigger and better house. I mean, if you don't ask the questions and honestly evaluate, then you can succumb to the leaven of Herod, fame, fortune, and power. It's asking yourself, where do I see selfishness raise its ugly head in my life, in relationship with my spouse, maybe my kids, maybe the colleagues at work, with my neighbors? So he says it begins by engaging our minds. But notice, he asks us secondly to engage our hearts. He says, is your heart still hardened? I mean, engaging your heart means stop holding back. It means giving yourself in wholehearted devotion to God, to what He cares about, to what He's doing in this world. It means evaluating your involvement in things not based necessarily on your abilities, but your availability to Him. And then thirdly, notice he says, having eyes do you not see, having ears do you not hear? Now that was a phrase used by Jesus numerous times with His followers. He's asking us to engage our senses. In other words, to see beyond the physical realm. I mean, he's saying don't look at just the surface of life. That's not all there is. Don't come to that conclusion. I mean, the feeding of the 4,000 was not about hungry people being satisfied. That's what it says on the surface. It's about the disciples coming to grips with their selfishness and then seeing God's provision, miraculous provision, in the midst of all that. So go, look at the world around you, but see beyond just the physical. Try to engage with the spiritual. And then finally, he tells us to engage our memories. It says, and do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said 12. Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said 7. You know, the lessons we learn in life through the circumstances of life can be easily forgotten. I mean, hasn't God provided for you just exactly what you've needed? I mean, over the years, He's provided for most of us in great abundance beyond just what we need. When was the last time you set aside time to think about that and maybe jot some of those things down? And then read back over them. And then invest time thanking God for each one of those that came from His hands. You see, when we invest our minds, our heart, our senses, our memory, then it allows God to begin developing in us an eternal vision rather than a temporal one. In fact, it was Helen Keller who was once asked by a reporter, "Is there anything worse than being blind?" And she responded without hesitation, "Yes, having sight, but no vision." If you'll take the time to invest your mind, your heart, your senses, and your memory, you will begin seeing God work around you in unique ways. And then you can begin joining with Him in what He's doing. Father, I have to confess I am blind in so many different ways, not the least of which is my own selfishness. Now, please help me and help us engage our minds, our hearts, our senses, our memory so that we can begin seeing what You're doing in this world around us. And then would You give us the courage to join with You and be available to You. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you for coming. If you came prepared to give, offering boxes are outside the door. If you've got questions about the things going on here at Horizon, please drop by the Hearth Room. 3rd door on the left. We would love to engage with you there. Enjoy the rest of this great day.